So my name is Kim Davenport, and I am the Communications Manager for Tacoma Historical Society. And it is my great pleasure today to be with two guests. We have Lisa Hoffman, who is a professor in the School of Urban Studies at the University of Washington, Tacoma, and Mary Hanneman, who is an associate professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences from the University of Washington, Tacoma. And they are here to discuss with me their brand new book, Becoming Nisei, which I've just had the pleasure of reading, and I'm very honored and delighted to be able to ask them some questions about the project. So welcome, Mary and Lisa, and thank you for being here with me. My first question starts with a little bit of a story in that we've all known each other for quite some time. We've all been part of the UW community for many years, and I remember very distinctly when I first arrived at UW Tacoma, the conversations around the Japanese language school, and that was still standing at that time, and how to capture that history, especially when it became clear that the university would be having to demolish that building. So I was hoping we could start by having you talk a little bit about how you first became involved in this project many years ago.
Yeah, and thank you for having us. We're really looking forward to this, and we agree. It's great to see you again, Kim. So it's true that University of Washington Tacoma purchased the Tacoma Japanese Language School building that sat on South Tacoma Way at 17th in the 90s. And it was a part of the extended footprint of the 2B UW Tacoma campus. And they did a historic preservation study in the early 2000s to try to determine if the building could be saved. And they decided, the recommendation was that there would be so many changes to the structure because it was in such bad condition, and we should be thinking about why it was in such bad condition. This is one of the points of the book. It's not just that there is a building in disrepair, but it had to do with wartime incarceration, that there was this building in disrepair. And so the decision was made that it could not be saved, and the building was torn down finally in 2004. But in the early 2000s, the campus leadership put a call out and let everybody know what was happening, which you also remember as well. They put a call out to the faculty and staff to see if anybody was interested in working on trying to save some of the social history related with this building. And Mary and I both raised our hands. We did not know each other then. And Mary's historian of modern Japan. I'm a cultural anthropologist that have done most of my work in China at that time. And so we came together to this project through an interest in that building in particular. So Mary,
When the university decided that they were going to have to demolish the building, one of the events that I don't remember exactly how it came about, but there was a kind of a mini reunion of some of the students, the alums of the school, and they came back to Tacoma, and the university hosted a kind of a event for them. So we went to that, and we kind of made contact with some of the former students, and talking to them about what could we do to memorialize the school, to kind of commemorate the school, and that kind of got the ball rolling on what ended up being these extensive interviews with the former students. So we interviewed about 42 former students, mostly born between about 1915 to 1940. And so just kind of naturally and organically, because of that, the book essentially came about to be about the pre-war period. And as we were doing it, we kind of came to realize that this is an important period for a couple of reasons. One is it's not quite as well studied as the incarceration period, but also, and because of that, it's kind of viewed, that pre-war period is kind of viewed as this interlude between 1924, when there was a major U.S. Immigration Act put in place called familiarly called the Exclusion Act, actually called the Reed-Johnson Act. Johnson was one of the representatives who sponsored the bill, who had been Tacoma, what was the newspaper called at that time? He had been the editor of the newspaper. So probably a lot of people watching this know about his history. But anyway, so in 1924, that major, immigration bill was passed. And then 1942, when incarceration began. And so that period is sometimes kind of seen as this like not much going on. In fact, there's a lot going on. And so, this project kind of enabled us to recreate that to some extent. And really what we found is this real vibrant community here in Tacoma, very vibrant, a lot of things going on, a lot of businesses, and this, whole sections of town that really had developed around this.
And also because after the war, many of the Japanese Americans from Tacoma did not return, we ended up traveling to Oakland, California, Los Angeles, and Chicago to do a number of the interviews.
So it's no surprise then that we're seeing this book published in 2021. Even though you started it in the early 2000s, it sounds like a really big undertaking, all of those interviews and that research. So one of the things that was most interesting to me as a reader that made this book really unusual, I thought, is the fact that you are two distinct academic, voices bringing two distinct perspectives to this project. What was it like engaging in that process of co-researching and co-writing a book from your different perspectives?
Well, am I supposed to go first on this one?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it was something I had never really done before. And I think we both found that it was a really rich experience, that even though we came at it from our own disciplinary backgrounds, that we kind of came to kind of new understandings and conclusions that we wouldn't have come to just on our own. Even though those kind of conclusions made sense within our own disciplines, they wouldn't have been something that we could have got to on our own. And I think, I think back to the kind of the history of the project and how we, would have these days of just kind of laying everything out on a table in some kind of a space, either my house, Lisa's house, someplace on campus, and just kind of going over everything we had and seeing what came up and then being able to kind of process that with each other. So I think one of the big concerns for both of us was that we would end up having a book that, because one of us would take the lead on one chapter, the other would take the lead on the other chapter, but then, we'd exchange and read and talk and rewrite and everything. But one of our concerns was that it would come out as a book that, well, you wrote this chapter, and the reader's experience would be that way, kind of like head turning, But I don't think it did come out that way. I think it came out pretty well integrated. Hope so anyway.
Yeah, there's lots of passing back and forth. And, the interesting thing is we recognize neither one of us is an Asian American specialist, right? That we have our own disciplinary baggage, you could say, that we bring to the project. And that it also meant we could really rely on each other for the parts where we were not the expert. So, Mary, as the historian, understood kind of that those types of issues, and I had other types of things that I brought to the project. But part of it was learning to rely on each other and say, well, I don't need to actually go down that lane because Mary's going down that lane, and vice versa. And then I will say there's just some things that I experienced for the first time, like going to the archives in the special collections at UW libraries, which Mary is much more familiar with as an experience, but it was just that part was really a lot of fun.
So, Mary, I have a question for you primarily. Part of the unique experience of Japanese Americans that's covered by the pre-war era that you're talking about is the distinct status that the different generations held within the US. Could you explain a little bit more about the history of that and the relationship between Japan and the United States at that time that led to the parents and children having essentially different statuses as residents here in the United States?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to also kind of go back to something that Lisa said about neither one of us being Asian Americanists. And a lot of times people, find out, oh, you teach Japanese history, and they think that therefore I know about Japanese American history. And they're really two very separate fields. And so I guess I feel like, however, having said that, in order to kind of understand the transnational element, you have to kind of understand the Japanese experience at the time of the initial migration from Japan to the United States. And that would be then the Issei, or first generation Japanese immigrants. And at that time, Japan was opening up to the outside world for the first time. This is the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and was trying, to modernize itself and become a part of the Western international community. Kind of, people at that time in Japan even kind of talked about leaving Asia, And so part of that process for Japan as a nation was to actually send Japanese out to emigrate to the West, including obviously the United States. And they even thought of that as kind of an instrument of national policy or foreign policy, and even published guidebooks, how to be a good migrant, behave yourself and do this and do that, eat these foods, wear these kinds of clothes and everything. But in terms of kind of that generational difference that you were referring to, that Issei generation, Japanese persons of Japanese origin were not allowed to become US citizens. They were considered aliens, ineligible for citizenship. Well, their children were born in the United States. The Nisei, the second generation, were born in the United States, and they had the right of citizenship by birth. So you have this very unusual situation. I don't know how unusual, maybe it's not that unusual, except that what was unusual about it is that the Issei could not become naturalized US citizens. So they, as a result, really had to maintain some kind of a connection to Japan. Obviously, a lot of immigrants do maintain a connection to their home, their native country, but in this case, it was really vital, because they otherwise wouldn't have had they would have been stateless, so they wouldn't have had any kind of legal status. So they organized, for example, Japanese associations that were organizations in the United States that it kind of promoted or enabled that contact back with Japan, and enabled to help them with various legal papers like visas and birth records, death records, all of those kinds of things. So I don't know, does that kind of answer your question, Lisa? I mean, Kim?
Yeah, I think it's really important context, because I think many Americans can think back in their own family tree to immigrant ancestors who had that experience of, they had a tie to their home country and then their children were born here, but they had the option of becoming naturalized. And I think this is a distinct status that's important about understanding what happened to those different generations and how they interacted with each other. So I appreciate the extra explanation on that.
Yeah, and I guess I would also add is that it also meant that kind of these anti-Asian legislation was really essentially legal discrimination, and they also could not own land, and so that really factors into what we did in the book in terms of kind of understanding the how this history and the physical built environment that they created was just lost because they were not able to really maintain a stake in it.
There's also an element just in terms of arguments about the immigrant experience that we wanted to address, and through the transnational argument, that you often hear about heritage and assimilation and acculturation, these kinds of processes. There's also lots of literature about the Nisei as a bridge between Japan and the US. And that just seemed too static, and between two particular points, almost like a piece of infrastructure, and they would move back and forth between it. But the interviews themselves, the narratives that they told, were kind of much more nuanced and about process and negotiation. And so we use the term bridging to try to reflect that type of an experience as an immigrant. And yes, specific to the Japanese American experience of being the alien land laws, et cetera. But also, I think, an approach to identity formation that would make sense to a lot of people too.
So that kind of leads nicely into my next question, which was an interesting or a theme that really struck home for me, which was constantly reading about stories of walking and walking through a space and having this spatial experience with the areas that they lived, the Nisei in Tacoma. And these reminded me of the stories that I grew up hearing from my parents and my grandparents about Tacoma. I think it does speak to the fact that Tacoma is very walkable, and a lot of people have that relation. But there's a distinction, of course, which is that my ancestors were not limited to a particular neighborhood, and they didn't face the same kind of discrimination. So, Lisa, can you speak to that theme that really seems to flow through a lot of the interviews about just that really specific spatial relationship that these people had with the areas in which they lived?
Yes, we'd love to talk about that. The core argument is that placemaking and people making are connected, right? So in some of the academic language, it's subjectivity and spatiality, but that's the basic idea. And we thought we would help illustrate what this means by first showing you a clip. And the clip is of Ryo Munakata, Dr. Munakata, a dentist, and also a leader in the community who was really instrumental to this project being successful in the Nisei Tacoma community. So he was born in 1921, and he was the oldest of 3 children. His father was from Hiroshima Prefecture, and his father went to Hawaii at the age of 16 in 1906, if you can just imagine. 6 months later, he joined his brother in Seattle before relocating down to Tacoma. And then in 1919, his father returned to Japan for his own father's funeral and got married to a local woman, and they came back to the US. Rio's father worked at the Union Laundry between Market and Broadway. People can think about those locations, in an alley just off of South 15th. He also attended Central School to learn English, so he went with the little children. And then the Munakata family, while Ryo was growing up, ran a number of hotels. And we'll hear in one of the clips that we have, we'll hear about that. So let me just do the screen share.
I well remember, we'd go to the public schools. Classes start anywhere around 8:30, and it would finish around 3 o'clock. And then between 3 and 4, we either had to go home and then go to the language school, or we went directly. Mm-hmm. And if we did go home, we'd find time to pick up something to munch on. Mm-hmm. And you'd pick it up and then start walking to school, and whatever you have in your hand, you're eating it. And I well remember our teacher saying, it's not proper to be standing, let alone walking, to be eating food. Mm-hmm. And that's so sometimes we cheat and we put something in our food and walk in the street. You try not to move your jaw all of this. And when I think of that, like I mentioned about 13th to 15th and the merchants, the owner of the business would be standing right there in the store, and they would be looking out. Mm-hmm. And as we walk the street, you see them, and they know you, and I know them. You must bow your head and acknowledge. Mm-hmm. You just couldn't walk by without acknowledging each other. So when I went to California, it was nothing for the people in California to walk and see another Japanese American fellow, a person, and not bow, because they're really strangers. But I grew up in a community where we knew each other, so invariably we would bow and acknowledge. And so to me.
Okay. And so what Ryo is explaining in this clip is what we call spatial stories. right? So it is the telling of oneself and one experience through where he went and what he did, it in literally the daily paths. And so it's going to school, it's going to the language school every day after going to the public school. Um, and we recognize that there's both their own agency, making decisions and walking on the streets and claiming some belonging, even if it's a fleeting sense of belonging. But at the same time, and this is what you were referring to in the question, Kim, that there's clearly prevailing social and power relations. So again, it's a segregated city. There's experiences of discrimination. There are the alien land laws where their parents could not, as alien and ineligible for citizenship, their parents could not own land. So it was a much more kind of precarious situation. And so when we think about the daily walking paths, and in just a moment, I'll share a map of some of those paths. And, you know, we have interviewees who talk, for instance, about, and we walked and we walked and we walked. And in highlighting this, we see that their own sense of self was being constituted through these spatial movements. And yet, because of these prevailing power relations that, you know, they experienced as a minority with all the anti-Asian legislation that was coming from California, that these were not official mappings that they were creating, but they're much more of these kinds of tactical moves. And it's what this one theorist calls a kind of migrational city that's more fragmented, but it is about the constitution of the self. And so let me just do a quick share here. And so this is a map that we have in the book, and it looks at the experience of 4 different Nisei, and we'll talk a little bit later about those families that live down on the tide flats. Rio Munakata is right here. This is what he described in walking to school every day, and then coming back to the Tacoma Japanese language school over here. You know, the other part is the language school itself is really important because it was a secular institution. So there was only one language school in Tacoma, unlike other communities on the West Coast and in Hawaii, where they were started by religious organizations. And so this was a place where all the Nisei who were going to the school would gather. They weren't broken up. And they used language such as it brought the community together. It was our second home. It was a playground, a gathering place for all of us. And so this building itself as a particular place is very important in that kind of spatial aspect of identity. And then the last thing that we wanted to you know, emphasize is that when you see this landscape disappear, and again, we can talk about why it has disappeared in the way it has, that can also be experienced as an erasure of the self. So in the same way that the self is constituted through these spatial experiences, it can also, this kind of systemic structural erasure can be experienced as an erasure of the self. So the spatial stories that they told us in these interview narratives can be understood then as a way they reconstitute and revisibilize themselves on their own terms. And so I think these are processes that many people experience and go through. But the wartime incarceration is distinctive here and has to be emphasized, because again, you know, why was the language school building in such bad shape, right? It has to do with that, those kinds of government actions.
Yeah, that really leads me directly to my next question, because this was one of the most fascinating things to me about reading this book. I've read many times and looked at many photographs and read accounts of the, you know, the executive order from the president that led to the evacuation and incarceration of the Japanese. And I think a lot of our audience, who are people who are interested in local history, would be fairly familiar with that moment in time. But can you delve a little bit more into, after the war, during and after the war, what led to these spaces that used to be, you know, such a lively Japantown in the center of our city, really being erased from our landscape. I think that's maybe a slightly less obvious impact of the removal of the Japanese. We think about the removal of the people and the incarceration, of course, but I don't think we spend as much time thinking or talking about the removal of their spaces, the physical spaces where they had lived.
Yeah, well, and we've talked about kind of the legal framework that you know made it well impossible for the Nisei to own land, and you know one of your questions, Kim, that you had given us earlier as we prepared for this is kind of what were some of the surprising things that we came upon, and I'm sure you'll ask that question later, but I was thinking about that, and I remember one of the most poignant things that I came upon was looking through there were some Japanese language newspapers that were published in Tacoma between 1915 and 1942. And I was looking at one of the last, in fact, the last issue of one of those newspapers. And in it were a couple of advertisements from like secondhand shops in Tacoma, you know, owned by Caucasian owners, Fred such and so, I can't remember the names, but they were in Japanese and they were saying, you know, to the Japanese, ladies and gentlemen, you know, please, no, bring us your household items, your furniture, we'll give you a good, you know, top dollar, who knows what top dollar meant, you know, under those conditions. But, you know, it just kind of really brought home to me what really had happened to this community, you know. And also the fact, for example, that the Japanese language school itself was used as a civilian control center, so that when the you know, evacuation order came, the members of the Japanese community were expected to go register there, you know, at the Japanese language school. And we talked to some, you know, one of the interviewees that we talked to, for example, was one of the older Nisei, and she talked about how the fact that she, you know, was adept at both Japanese and English, and she, you know, she had played this kind of responsible role of kind of helping the older Issei to navigate this, you know, situation where they were being forced to leave everything behind. And so really, again, that idea that this part of town did not fall into disrepair for just, you know, there was a reason that these buildings fell into disrepair, because there was no one there to maintain them. And so, you know, then the next stage is, well, this is ripe for the plucking and, you know, new development. Of course, that's a you know, constant in the urban landscape. But, you know, I think it's just important to understand that there were other forces at work here that had to do with kind of this legal framework, this discriminatory framework that the Japanese community faced.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Mary.
Well, I was going to just also mention that, you know, if we look at that landscape today, there are actually now only 2 buildings in Tacoma that were, you know, built by this pre-war Tacoma Japanese community. And one of them is the Japanese Buddhist temple on Fawcett. And the other is just down the street from that on like 21st and Fawcett, the Wesley Memorial Methodist Church, which is now as a, you know, art program basically for UW Tacoma. So there's only one building in Tacoma that was built by the Japanese community that is still used in its original for its original purpose. And the other thing that I just think is very poignant about this is, if anyone, you know, I'm sure many people are familiar with the Tacoma Japanese Temple, but if you look across the street from that, you'll see all these empty lots, vacant lots. And those were homes of the, you know, Japanese community where kids were playing and all of that kind of stuff back in the day, you know, and they remain vacant even today. For how much longer, we'll see.
Yeah, we also had a research assistant on the project who was getting her master's degree in geospatial technologies, and she did some great work on trying to do some of these, the mapping. She actually went through kind of all of the spatial references in the interviews and made them mappable. So that's also why we have some great maps, and we'll share some more of those. But she found of 40 discrete buildings that were mentioned 3 or more times by the interviewees, in 2018, 36 of those were either vacant or were parking lots, right? So this is something that happens over time. And it's also related to urbanization trajectories and federal funding for certain types of investments in the urban infrastructure. So it's a very complicated, kind of long-standing process that takes time. But one of the things we want to emphasize is that that's also based on a kind of structural forgetting and collective amnesia that gets reproduced. And so that's a part of this is just getting us to remember some different aspects of the landscape.
I mentioned to you on the telephone, I think I did, I can practically name all the businesses and family names that lived on both sides, the east side of Broadway and the west side of Broadway, between 13th and 15th.
Would you be willing to tell us?
Oh, okay. I thought I'd write it out for you and then we give it to you.
That's wonderful.
On this side of the street, west side of the street, right here by 13th and Broadway, on the street level, there was a beer tavern, and it was called Happy Days Are Here Again. And I think it was during the Depression year where, what did you call, prohibition was, and then it got to the point where people could have their alcohol, and the restaurant was titled Happy Days Are Here Again. And there was a Fuji 10-cent store. The daughter of that business is living here in Tacoma. I understand she's living in old Tacoma area. And then we had a Chinese food restaurant. We had another hotel called Victoria Hotel. And next to that was the Mayflower Hotel where Lady Mrs. Yoshioka ran. And she also had a fox farm. She raised,
There, right?
no, it was, I remember visiting her farm where she raised the silver fox for, ladies used to wear. And further down the street, there was another hotel called AB Hotel. And next to the hotel was a family named Mori, M-O-R-I. And they had a cleaning business. Next to that was a barber shop. The lady's name was Mrs. Kubo. And her mother and her 2 daughters came up from California for this reunion.
Oh,
And next door to that was a lady by the name of Mrs. Jinguji, who had a barber shop. Then there was a Japanese restaurant, and there was another, more like a fruit stand and a counter. And in the back room, when we were small, we were told, no, you can't go back there because it's an area where people like to gamble. And next door to that, there was another family by the name of Mori. The father was a shoe repairman. And next door to that was I think it was Chinese garden, Chinese food. And I think the family's name was Takasugi. And I mentioned this yesterday during our reception. Their son, their 3rd son is Bob Takasugi, who came here. Well, in fact, he became a federal judge. He was the first Japanese American selected to the federal judge amongst the Japanese American people. Now, he left Tacoma with evacuation from the Union Station. And so he said he was just an infant practically. And then when the Union Station was dedicated as a federal court, he returned to Tacoma to be the guest speaker, keynote speaker for the dedication. And I think he mentioned in his speech, it's ironic that this is the very place I was forced to leave, and I'm back here to dedicate your court building. And he lives in the Los Angeles area today. Let's see. And next door to that was a Japanese confection store, and they also sold Japanese magazines and books. And next to that, there was a family named Takahashi that ran a grocery store. And then next to that was a rice bowl Chinese food place run by a Chinese family. And next to that was a Mr. Hoshige's pharmacy drugstore. And those stores were in a building on the corner of 15th and Broadway. And it's called New Washington Hotel. And it was run by a family named Suyama. And very corner, first floor, was another food stand, ice cream fountain, and in the back was a pool room, and run by a family named Obayashi, I think it was. And on the side that I lived, there were less. But I remember a drugstore in the corner where we, as a child, we'd go there and buy something, and the druggist would give us a piece of candy. And then, so when we needed something from the drugstore, we always volunteered. And then further down the street, my father had his UW Tacoma hotel. And then there was a photographer, there was another barber shop, and next to that, there was a tailor shop by the family of Nakata, named Nakata. And then further down the street, there was a family that had a gift shop. They also sold fishing tackle, and by gift, I mean not small gifts, but they were very elaborate and expensive gifts. And the name was Mr. Niyama, Niyama. Then we go down the street, there was a market, another Chinese food restaurant. And then there was a shoe repair store that also sold new shoes. And the man's name was Mr. Kawai. And in fact, his son is here for the meeting. And then up the corner was a dry goods store. And somewhere in between there was Mr. Fukui, who had a weekly Japanese newspaper. That's just one block.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So we also have a map to share, and this is also in the book. And it's really, if you think, here's Broadway, and he was talking about between 13th and 15th. And I think many of us are very familiar with what this looks like today. You know, after he described all of this later in the interview, he does say, but it's all gone now.
It's transfixing to look at that map for me, because it's so amazing, the density of businesses and residences, and clearly that's the area that we refer to as Japantown. But one of the things I found fascinating in reading the book is that you also uncovered that there were some other areas of Tacoma with a documentable Japanese American population. It wasn't just maybe one house, but it was actually a little community. Can you talk about the other two primary areas in Tacoma that did have a Japanese American population during that time?
Sure, I can get us started on that. And you note that you were a little bit surprised by that. And frankly, we were too. And it did take us a little while to put all the pieces together. And we started by recognizing how many of the Nisei we're talking about the lumber industry and the sawmills and working in the sawmills, which is not really emphasized in the existing histories. But 25 of the 42 people that we interviewed talked about working in this industry. And then we also started to recognize, again, when you're doing this research, it takes a while. They're like, wait a second, a number of them are also talking about the St. Paul and Tacoma Lumber Company. And then somebody else is talking about how there were some families that would cross the bridge to come to the language school. So we're trying to figure out, what bridge is this? Where is this? And then we realized that somebody else mentioned living on St. Paul Avenue, which is down in the tide flats. And so when you start, putting these pieces together, we start to realize that there are these other communities that were doubly invisible. And that was also true for these places called roadside markets that were somewhere in the South. And it took a while to get that documentation together. I do remember, and again, this is with that great research assistant that we had, Sarah Pyle. We were together up in the Special Collections in Seattle, and we found a map that showed St. Paul Avenue and those 14 houses. We're like, there it is. It's right there. And I'll share right now a map. So here you see the 14 houses and the families that lived in these various houses down through here as well. And then in Ron Magden's papers that are also in UW Special Collections, we found an unpublished memoir by Clinton Butsuda, who is just an amazing writer and had this incredibly vivid description of life down on St. Paul Avenue. And you can see number 10 down here, his family lived there. And he describes both this Japanese bunkhouse where a number of single Japanese men lived. And we also recognize in some of the other interviews that they talked about women who would cook for these bachelor men or single men. They may have had families that weren't able to come to the US. And then he also describes the St. Paul and Tacoma Hotel on the other end of the street, which is where the white clientele would stay. And so there are these kinds of wonderful stories that emerged through this. In addition, there was a number of interviewees who talked about going down to Tokyo Beach in the tide flats during the summer. And we couldn't ever really figure out where that was. And frankly, that area has changed so much. And we just look at Puyallup tribal history as well. And we know how much early industrialization and continued processes have changed that landscape. But it was through those kinds of connections that we started to piece that together. And then Mary and I wanted to share one other map. And this will kind of show, again, this is a map that's in the book. So you see the downtown core that we were just talking about, the 13th to 15th area, but frankly, it's broader than that, going down to 19th as well. The community that lived on the tide flats right here on St. Paul Avenue, and then the roadside markets that were way down here in South Tacoma around South 84th. And it was also through connections with the Polk City Directory that, again, our RA did some fantastic work of actually finding, oh, here's this flower stand. The Kimura's family ran that stand. And so it was through those kinds of processes that we're able to get those on the map. And again, to try to reconstitute some of what's been lost and as we argue, structurally erased and forgotten.
No, I so appreciated learning that new information, and it logically makes sense to me. With every story I've ever delved into in Tacoma's history, it makes more sense knowing that there were these different places around town that would have had Japanese American population, because that holds true to what we've seen with other immigrant groups coming to Tacoma. So it's really wonderful to add that to the record, and those maps are fascinating. I want to move on now to what I found personally to be the most powerful story in the book, because it kept recurring as I was reading in the oral histories that you captured. And then at the end of the book, you talk about what happened during the incarceration to a few of the people that you've been describing throughout the book. And the principal of the Japanese language school proved to be the most moving story to me, to understand just how important he was in the lives of these young people. And then to find out that he passed away so much before his time in custody of the US government. It was just really a heart-wrenching story. And I admit, being a bit surprised, knowing that I went into reading this book feeling like, oh yeah, I'm already a bit familiar with this history, and I kind of know what I'm getting into. No, I was just broadsided by the pure emotion of that story. So I credit you in what might seem on its surface to be an academic book to be really one that does pull your emotions in and make you feel these stories. I've really appreciated that. But I'm interested if you can talk a little bit more about why this man was so important in the lives of these young people.
Well, Kim, it really means a lot to us that story moved you. When you told us that earlier, that just really, that moved me, actually, So Mr. Yamasaki really was a center of the community. And I think, we didn't do a tally, but practically every single interviewee that we talked to said, you have to talk about Mr. Yamasaki and Mrs. Yamasaki. And they were really seen as a team. Some of the people said, well, Mrs. Yamasaki was the backbone of the school, But one of the things that I regret is that we never found anything that was identifiably written by Mr. Yamasaki himself. So it was always this kind of like finding out about him in these roundabout ways. We found some things that we think that he wrote, but even then they were kind of like a compendium of other people's thinking about education and so on. But he seems like he must have been a very charismatic individual. He had a solid education. He came to the United States with a university degree in Japan. And I think that gave him probably a certain kind of dignity in the community. So one of the things that we talk about in the book is the way that the Issei, the first generation, brought with them the values of this particular part, this particular point of Japan's history that we were talking about earlier. In particular, a document called the Imperial Rescript on Education. I don't want to get into great detail about that, but basically it kind of summarized a lot of the values that the Japanese government at that time in the 1890s wanted to kind of really ensure were part of the kind of fabric of society. And they included some, what we might think of as basically traditional Japanese values like loyalty and discipline, self-discipline, hard work, dedication, don't bring shame, and that kind of a thing. That document actually would go on to have a different kind of role if you're only thinking about Japanese history. But if you're thinking about Japanese history, Japanese American history in the United States, those values were really important to the Issei generation, and that's what they kind of wanted to pass on to their children in the language school. And Mr. Yamasaki, as principal, really conveyed that well. For example, they would have these ceremonies at the school to commemorate the emperor and various Japanese holidays. He would read this Imperial Rescript on Education at that time. And just he seemed to have a lot of dignity, and and I think that people thought almost that he conveyed that dignity to the larger community. You know, he was the one who was kind of the face of the community. There were issues, for example, with the public school system at some particular points, and he would meet with the superintendent of schools in Tacoma and kind of represent the community. And I think they felt really proud and good about that. But the story that you're talking about, he was picked up actually in December of 1941, like a couple of days after Pearl Harbor. He was picked up by the FBI. In fact, the FBI had kept watch lists of particular Japanese on the West Coast, people actually like Mr. Yamasaki, Japanese language school principals, people who were involved in martial arts clubs. I was thinking about this, you know, martial arts or something, we all know about martial arts, judo, kendo, taekwondo, whatever. But at that time, in the 1930s, 1940s, martial arts, you know, what does that mean? And so he was kind of the leader of the kendo club in Tacoma. So I think that was something the FBI kind of had on their watch list. And people who had traveled back to Japan, photographers, those kinds of things, put people, you know, a little check mark against their name for the FBI. So Mr. Yamasaki was amongst a small handful of people in Tacoma. I think maybe in Tacoma about 20, I don't remember off the top of my head. In Seattle, there were more who were arrested in the days after Pearl Harbor. He was sent to Fort Missoula. So this is kind of distinct. It was part of the incarceration, but distinct from the incarceration because these people, the FBI in particular, had suspicions about these people. Ungrounded, I would say, but nevertheless. So they were treated differently. And he was ultimately sent to Lordsburg in New Mexico, which was a Department of Justice camp for people of a different kind of level of suspicion, it was not an incarceration camp. One of our interviewees told us that, that she had heard that, well, first of all, he died, he became ill, maybe in Missoula, and then, he never recovered, but he became ill and he died at Lordsburg in New Mexico. And one of our interviewees told us that, someone who had brought back his nail clippings and his hair clippings to his widow as, the only thing that she had of his. And in fact, that we corroborated that in a newspaper article about him. But she also told us that he was heard to have said, is this democracy? When he was being questioned in this Department of Justice camp. So it's a tragic story, and it's tragic that it happened to him, obviously, but it's tragic that it happened to the community, and it was replicated across so many of the other stories from this period. Lisa, do you have anything to add?
Well, we do have a couple clips. And so maybe we'll show the first one is of two siblings, the Tyra siblings, talking about the presence that Mr. Yamasaki and Mrs. Yamasaki had. And so we'll start with that one.
I don't have two. I know they were Mrs. Yamasaki. Oh, Yamasaki, a very gentle, kind person.
Yeah.
Of course, we were afraid of Mr. Yamasaki.
Yes. All he had to do was, and I'll never forget that face when he came to that window because we were too rowdy. Oh, I tell you, he didn't have to say a word.
Well, he must have been a great organizer or a great administrator to get those teachers to handle us. And it's amazing. After 6 hours in American school, and you go to the second school, you're not too.
Yeah, another 2 hours.
But those teachers were so dedicated. So all the focus seems to be on the principal, Mr. and Mrs. Yamasaki, but I give a lot of credit to the teachers too.
Who put up with the
Yeah.
classroom.
Great. We also have some powerful recollections by Harue Ozaki, who is actually sitting here with her husband, who did not grow up in Tacoma, but we'll share this clip now.
And I'm so glad that you asked that question, because I wanted to go on and tell you something that was so unsettling to me, which was that Yamasaki sensei was someone who we just revered and had looked for, you know, the great values of being Japanese, not only from our parents, but also this great leader. And when he was interned, maybe near Sam's father's, but this one was in Lordsburg. Is that where your father was?
No, Santa Fe.
Oh, Lordsburg, New Mexico. And he was kept there, and he championed truly for us to be democratic citizens of the United States. That was also as important as gathering the Japanese nationalistic beliefs. And it hurts me to think that he was never released like the others were released, because other inmates that were released in Tacoma had come back with stories that they could hear Yamasaki sensei crying out. I think in the middle of being tortured, he would cry out, "Is this the meaning of democracy?" And that's very unsettling to me, in that it seems to bring back the same kind of scenario that you hear of today.
We should note that's Harue Kawano is her maiden name. And her, she had an older sister, and her mother was one of the teachers at the school.
Thank you so much for sharing the clips, especially because I recognize some of the stories that I read, but it's just such a different experience to actually get to see the faces and hear those voices. So thank you for that. So I have an open-ended question for each of you, which is, what was the most surprising or interesting thing for each of you about doing this research?
You know, for one thing, I did not know this until Lisa mentioned it the other day, that working in the archives was something kind of new and special, because it's like, oh, that's what you do when you do history, like, here we go again, you know. But so I was delighted to hear that, actually. But really coming upon things in the archives, like essays written by some of the people that we interviewed, and thinking, oh, this is what she or he was thinking about when they were 12 or 16 or whatever. That was really pretty neat to you know, come upon something like that. And then also for me, just recognizing that there had been this very important part of Tacoma, this very vibrant community that really is gone, just gone now. So.
Yeah, I will have to echo what Mary was noting. I think it was those connections, such as the tide flats. You know, that was surprising. And then it was also understanding the extent of the small businesses that were being run by the Japanese American community, and then thinking about that just disappearing. So we all know these things from history books, but when you get into that kind of detail and the human stories, it becomes more powerful.
You know, one other thing that really meant a lot to me was that this generation is exactly my parents' generation. And that was really special to get to talk to them and recognize that even though this was a different, you know, group of people who were discriminated against, who you know, faced different challenges than my parents faced, there's still something generational there that really, you know, unites them, and that made it very special for me to talk to them.
Yeah, and we were also pleasantly surprised that as two white women, that they were so open with us and willing to talk with us, and were very warm. I mean, really such incredible people. And the part that pains us the most is that for all sorts of reasons, it just took longer than we wanted it to get the book out. And we've lost many of the Nisei.
But I would argue that's why it's so important that the book is now out, right? You do the work to capture stories, and unfortunately, some of those very people probably didn't get a chance to read the book, but it is now out for others to get to learn from those stories. So I would certainly ask or tell anyone who asks me that they need to read this book. I have been telling everyone who talks to me that they have to read this book. It made a distinct impression on me. And largely for the reason that you were talking about, Lisa, that, you know, we learn about stories in history books. Sometimes we learn about national stories or international stories, but when you can make it local and you can make it personal, it's just more powerful on that emotional level, and you connect with it in a different way. So I really feel that that's something that this book does very well. But not to put you too much on the spot, but why do you both think that people should read this book? What would be your recommendation? What do you think is you know, why is it relevant to people's lives today to read a book like this?
Well, I think all we have to do is look at the terrible tragedy in Atlanta that recently happened to recognize that there's still a continuation of racial and spatialized violence. And so we need to be aware that this is not just in the past. And I then again, kind of directly coming out of what we think is important is that when we think about these stories and how they've been structurally erased and systematically forgotten, we recognize that it takes effort to continue to forget. And so if we maybe think differently about the urban process and we reflect on what does it mean to do equity-based planning, for instance, that capturing this and keeping this a part of our visioning going forward will be really important.
And I would just absolutely, you know, echo what Lisa said about the continuing anti-Asian violence and discrimination, that it's not a blip, it's historic and it's structural, and we need to recognize that. So that's, you know, on a very deep and serious level, and on a lighter level, the Tacomans getting to know Tacoma is really important to me too.
Yeah, it's a wonderful additional resource for that. And, you know, at the Historical Society, we're talking to people on a regular basis who are interested in learning more about maybe their home or their family history or whatever it might be. And whenever we can give more context to those kind of stories, the better. And this book really adds to what we have available. So I really can't thank you both enough for sitting down and talking with me about it. And I'm going to hold it up one more time. We do have it for sale in the Tacoma Historical Society Museum shop. And so congratulations on finally getting the book out after all of these years spent working on it. And thank you again for talking with me today.
Thank you, Kim. We really enjoyed it and really appreciated the questions that you asked as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. You're great questions. So
Thank you.
we appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.